Jeff Foot is out of town, and I don't know really what to do when he's not around, so it falls to me to write the music today. But there's just one problem, I don't really know how to play or sing or rhyme very well, but we've gotta have music, so I thought, what the heck, I'd give it a try, give it a try. What you need to know about today is that we're talking about the parts of the Bible that say stuff about people and marriage and love, because context is important when you're making a Bible podcast about what Jesus is teaching in Matthew 19 about people and marriage and love. Hey, my friends, it's Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. A couple times over the last couple of weeks here, I've brought up the NBC show Community because it's been on my mind because we just watched through the whole thing. And I think the other day we were talking about how that show unfolded right on the inflection point, the tipping point between how we all used to joke with each other and rib each other about stuff to the new way that we joke with each other, which is much more safe and protected. Maybe it's the age of the internet that has made us more aware of people who do things different or think differently than ourselves. And, well, the community happens on that divide between we just joke about things and whatever happens, happens. And the other half of the divide, which is, yikes, we don't know how to joke with each other anymore because we never really thought about what it would be like if we were all in an internet room together, and now we're all in an internet room together. And so resultantly, you watch the closing seasons of Community and you're like, yeah, that's pretty safe. This was definitely meant to play everywhere and not have anybody, well, except the people you're allowed to make fun of, be made fun of or feel bad. But then you go back and you watch the early stuff, and it's kind of a free-for-all. Like, everyone is going to be made fun of here. You go back and watch South Park never really got away from making fun of everybody, but earlier Simpsons was much more callous, much more willing to rib and skewer everything. And then you go back even further into shows from the 80s, 70s, 60s, and the further back you go, the more you're like, oh my goodness, there were just people who were the butts of these jokes all the time. And it's shocking now, given what seems like how you joke and how you don't joke, to go back and look at that. And probably some of that did need a bit of a corrective. Maybe we've overcorrected a little bit, and I still repeat that I yearn for the day when we can just talk candidly about anything together and give each other the benefit of the doubt and try to sort through things. And if we disagree at the end of the day, even if we disagree about deeply held things like, say, what somebody believes about God and the Bible and things like that, we could still just get along, rib each other, have a laugh about it. I still think that future is possible ahead of us. Obviously, we are in that transitional spot right now, as we've discussed before. But you know what it is to go back and dig up one of those time capsule bits of media, or talk with maybe somebody who's much, much older, never did the internet thing and never really was a part of culture building in this new era that we're in right now, and you hear him say stuff or you see things on those shows and you're just shocked by it. You're like, wow, it's almost as though you aren't even thinking about this wider, larger audience, or how this might someday offend people if the world changes and values change. And I feel like we kind of get that in the New Testament when we look at the teachings about gender and love and marriage. It's very, very clear that this material is not taking into account that people might think about this differently someday. It's very matter of fact. There seems to be no pushback, even from the strongest opponents of Jesus. Even the very liberal religious leaders are not coming up to Jesus and being like, wait a dang minute, that's your position on marriage? That's your position on gender and gender roles and eunuchs? That's so backwards and crazy. You're on the wrong side of history. This was the only side of history at that point, and for most of history, this has been the only side of history. For like the fourth time in this conversation about this passage, I say again, I do not bring that up to say if you have a different view on gender roles, marriage, and all of the other many surrounding hot button issues than what we're reading here in Matthew 19, or if you would nuance the text a little bit differently. I'm not saying that you are therefore bad and the enemy, or that I have some kind of gripe with you. All I'm trying to do is acknowledge that, yep, the Bible text, if we just look at the raw materials of it, looks different and sounds different than modern sensibilities that have come into vogue in the last few years regarding this conversation. Again, I say grace and peace to everyone as we work through this moment in time and figure out how to process these things together. That said, if we want to better understand what Jesus is talking about, as always, interpret the less clear in light of the more clear. If you run into a text and you're not sure what to do with it, just go look at other places where the same kind of subject matter comes up, and maybe you can get to the bottom of it. So that's what we're working on today. In Matthew 19, Jesus gets asked about whether or not it's lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason. That gets us into a conversation that is delicate because of divorce, that is delicate to modern sensibilities because of gender roles and marriage, and it also gets us into a conversation talking about eunuchs, which gets us into two things. One, the idea of being physically separated from any other pursuit in life and wholly dedicated to the life of the kingdom and the court. And it also gets us into questions about genitals and what if they're not normative and didn't work out like everybody else's because of something that happened at birth or something that happened after. And so because of all of that, I just want to flip back and look at the last time Jesus talked about this marriage and divorce thing and jog our memories about that. And that is in Matthew chapter 5, in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount, which is the first of the 5 big speeches around which Matthew structures his book. And you'll remember this when we get into chapter 5. Jesus talks about this new kingdom, the values of the kingdom, the Beatitudes. Then he says, don't think that I came to do away with the law. I didn't come to abolish it, but to fulfill it. And then he goes on to talk about this righteousness that has to exist for entrance to the kingdom to happen. But he says nobody has enough. Verse 20, he says, I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees or the teachers of the law, you'll certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. It's hyperbole that he's using here. Nobody is that righteous. And then he goes on to anticipate the question people would have who were being like, well, no, on all the big ones, I've never done anything naughty. I've never murdered. And Jesus flips that around on him. He's like, you've heard it said, don't murder. But I tell you, if you've hated somebody in your heart, you've got guilt before God that makes you not righteous enough to get into the kingdom. I'm paraphrasing like the whole chapter here. So when you read it, you got to look for the structure, but it's there. Then he does the same thing with strife and division. Then he does the same thing with adultery. Then he does the same thing with making brash oaths, but that in your heart are really just a deception or a front for dishonesty. And additionally, he does the same thing with divorce in verse 31. So Matthew 19, remember, is not the first time Jesus has given this teaching, but it is certainly the first time that he really fleshes it out. Here, the context is this whole, no matter how righteous you think you are because of your external actions, the heart is corrupt and your righteousness is not sufficient to enter the kingdom of heaven apart from this external righteousness of God that is imparted by God. So the teaching on divorce in verse 31 of Matthew 5 goes like this. It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. That's a reference back to that passage in Deuteronomy 24 that we'll revisit in a moment. And Jesus goes on, he says, but I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for marital unfaithfulness, causes her to become an adulteress, and anyone who marries the divorced woman commits adultery. And it's probably because of this teaching right here that the Pharisees in chapter 19 thought they saw an opening. I mean, they'd surely taken notes on what Jesus had said, and they're like, what can we go after him about? They probably thought to themselves, what Jesus said there, it smacks of the teachings of the Rabbi Shammai, who said the divorce rules were very stringent. And that'll be a huge turnoff to the teachings of the very popular, recently deceased Rabbi Hillel, who had much more flexible expectations for what justified a divorce. So I think they remembered this teaching, and I think they're hearkening back to that very cleverly, I might add. But I also think we need to give Jesus props here, because his teaching did not evolve between chapter 5, when he just has the conch and is standing in front of everybody and speaking, and chapter 19, when there's much more pressure, the stakes are much higher. Now people want to kill him. Specifically, the people asking the question want to kill him. Jesus is brave here. He's consistent. He said it one time, he says it the next time, he says it every time. And what he's driving at is an extension of this Deuteronomy 24 passage that I think we've alluded to a couple of times in the past few days, but not read. Deuteronomy 24, 1-4. If a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her from his house, and if after she leaves his house she becomes the wife of another man, and her second husband dislikes her and writes her certificate of divorce and gives it to her and sends her from the house, or if he dies, then her first husband who divorced her is not allowed to marry her again after she has been defiled. That would be detestable in the eyes of the Lord. So don't bring sin upon the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. It actually reads to me like Jesus' teaching is pretty consistent with Deuteronomy 24. He's saying this is a concession, not the ideal. Remember, Malachi 2 makes it really clear God hates divorce and that it's never the ideal, but God would seem to be existing in the realm of reality and understands that relationships break, things break, and sometimes a marriage has been over for a long time before the paperwork actually gets filed. So the concern here then flips to some sort of justice, some sort of protection to keep people from exploiting this loophole and just marrying younger again and again and again, and kicking your formerly vowed and now aging wife out on her can every time she gets too old or unattractive for your tastes. And this kind of high-class, highbrow, technically correct, technically legal divorce, it's, I think, very obviously frowned on in the passage I just looked at with you in Deuteronomy 24, and Jesus' teachings seem very consistent with that. God seems to be allowing for the fact that relationships will break, but not trying to allow for a loophole by which brutal, cruel injustices could occur toward women who were in a weaker position culturally in this society. But then we can't really talk about any of this without acknowledging that there was this assumption in the background of Christianity for the first several decades, and that is that what Jesus meant, and I don't think he specifically ever said this, but that what Jesus meant about the soon return of God was soon return in the mindset of people who had an average lifespan of 50 years old, and that would be a year or two, maybe a decade at the longest. And so when Jesus rises from the grave and is ready to ascend to the right hand of the Father in Acts chapter 1, the disciples are like, okay, well, now is soon. So are we going to do the reckoning and sort everything out? Is this the end of days that we're doing like right now? And Jesus, as you'll recall in Acts chapter 1, verse 8, is like, no, first you're going to be my witnesses to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to the ends of the earth. Well, how long does it take to go to the ends of the earth? A long time. So he's resetting the timeline a lot for the expectations people had, but it would seem the original audience had trouble shaking those expectations of this is all going to wrap up right now. They didn't anticipate this age of the church concept where orders of magnitude more people would be born and would come into the kingdom and become sons, daughters, heirs, agents of the kingdom. And so as a result, in the background of a lot of these conversations, we get the sense that people were like, well, what do we do with marriage if Jesus is coming back in like a week anyway? And it looks like that's what's going on the other end of the conversation in maybe the most prominent other passage about marriage and its significance in the New Testament, and that is in 1 Corinthians 7. And for the second day in a row, I'm going to get us right to the beginning of that passage and then run out of time. Unfortunately, there was just nowhere I could have shaved time today. There was no fruitless, silly, trivial thing that happened at any point in the conversation that I just could have cut so that we could get through this all at once, including this lengthy explanation right now of why we don't have time to get to 1 Corinthians 7. So I guess we'll just have to do it next time, and you'll have to come back and we'll have to hang out some more, which is going to be great. More stuff about what the New Testament says about people and love and marriage and how it all fits together to reflect back on what we make of Jesus' teachings in Matthew 19 next time around. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.